Chapter 2. A Clash of Ironclads. The Monitor and the Merrimac. Hampton Roads, Virginia, March 8th and 9th, 1862. A quote from Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister from 1940 to 1945. The combat of the Merrimac and the Mortimer made the greatest change in sea fighting since cannon fired by gunpowder had been mounted on ships. Seeing as how the Union's semi-brilliant plan of, hey, dudes, let's just charge straight at them, full frontal assault style, and see what happens, didn't work out quite as well as they were hoping, the North decided, forget that. Let's try something way more overly complicated instead. Under the direction of the new overall Army commander, George McClellan, the Yankees adopted a new plan. They'd leave a huge force behind to protect Washington, D.C., and keep the Confederates occupied. And meanwhile, they'd sail down the Atlantic coast, drop a few 100,000 dudes behind enemy lines on the peninsula outside Yorktown, Virginia, then go around and attack Richmond from the back. The Confederates didn't have nearly enough soldiers to defend their capital from both sides at the same time. So this 1-2 punch to the neck and kidneys would almost certainly be the thing to break the pesky rebellion's back once and for all. The first stage of the northern assault was a blockade of the Confederate shipyards at Norfolk, Virginia, to ensure that no rebel warships could get in or out to support the operation. So, in January 1862, a huge force of Union frigates parked themselves in the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, essentially building a disagreeable wall of wood, sails, and cannons, and daring the rebels to do something about it. But the South wasn't about to just lie down and let someone drop hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers on her shores without at least putting up a decent fight. The rebels had a plan to punch through the enemy blockade, reopen the waterways, and destroy the northern invasion before it happened. And they had a secret weapon to help them make sure they succeeded. A warship made out of iron, the first of its kind, the CSS Virginia. When the U.S. Navy abandoned the Norfolk Navy Yard at the outbreak of the war, they'd burned most of their ships, but the Confederates took one of the frigates that was still in decent condition. It was a 263-foot USS Merrimac, and upgraded her like an iPhone, encasing the entire ship in 4 inches of sloped iron plating, loading her up with 10 cannons, adding a couple of steam engines, and sticking a fearsome-looking 4-foot-long iron ram on the end of her to rip gnarly holes in the enemy ships and send them plummeting to the bottom of the ocean. When they were done, the rebels were so excited they renamed it the Virginia. The Union still called it the Merrimac, though, because that was their name for it, and they liked that much better than the Virginia anyway. Construction on the Virginia was completed on March 5th, 1862. Her maiden voyage would change the history of naval warfare forever and mess up a lot of warships in the process. When the Virginia set out on March 8th, most of her crew were under the impression that this was going to be a training mission. You know, something to make sure that a ship made out of iron could actually float without taking on water and sinking. But Captain Franklin Buchanan had other plans entirely. He was going to see exactly what this baby was capable of. He fearlessly sailed right into the entire enemy blockading fleet. Encased in 35-degree sloped iron and steel plating, the Virginia was utterly undeterred by anything the Union Navy had to throw at it. Belching black smoke and hurling ferocious steel and iron cannonballs from 10 gun ports along her hull, the Virginia audaciously lurched ahead in a white-knuckled charge at the USS Cumberland, a towering 50-gun Union warship that had dominated the high seas for the last 20 years. As you can probably imagine, the 5 Union warships of the blockading fleet didn't waste much time before turning every single one of their guns in the direction of the hideous metal monstrosity. Unfortunately for them, all they could do was watch in horror as even their biggest and most powerful cannons rounds bounced harmlessly off the iron hull like basketballs. The Virginia blitzed ahead, unfazed by the chaos, her iron ram pointed directly at the hull of the Cumberland. On her way to the Union flagship, she unleashed a sail by broadside, blasting the 50-gun USS Congress so intensely that it caught fire and ran aground. Then, as the rest of the blockading fleet watched, the Virginia crippled the Cumberland with a vicious broadside of cannon fire, then drove the tip of her ram into the Cumberland's belly, shredding the wooden ship into flotsam and hitting her so hard it snapped off the ram and left a chunk of metal inside the Union vessel, which sounds rather uncomfortable if you ask me. The Cumberland valiantly fired back at the Virginia, but her 50 cannons failed to make so much as a dent in the armor of the iron Confederate Leviathan. The Cumberland sank in minutes, taking 121 crew members with her. With the Cumberland down, the Virginia had turned attention to the Congress, which had run aground earlier in the fight and was now helplessly stuck on a sandbar. The Virginia sailed up beside her, loaded her guns with hot shot, that's cannonballs, that were heated in a special furnace until they were so hot that they glowed red, and unleashed a brutal volley that set the wooden frigate Congress on fire in several different places. The fire spread to the ammunition stores, blowing the ship into smithereens and killing over 120 crew members. One guy on the Congress did get a lucky shot with his rifle and hit the Virginia's captain in the groin with a musket ball, but it was only a small consolation. The Virginia spent the rest of the day playing whack-a-mole with the Union Navy, but a busted smokestack limited her effectiveness somewhat. She ran the other 3 Union warships, the frigates Minnesota, Roanoke, and St. Lawrence, aground, but the tides forced the Virginia to withdraw to deeper waters before she could finish them off. By the end of the day, the Virginia had sunk 2 warships, grounded 3 more, and inflicted over 400 casualties. It would be the worst destruction the U.S. Navy would experience until the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in World War II. The next morning, March 9th, 1862, the Virginia set out to finish the job she'd started the day before. The Union ships were still stuck aground, and it was obvious that old-school wooden frigates were no match for a fully armed and operational ironclad warship in a straight-up slugfest. To the crew of the CSS Virginia, all that remained was to put the Union blockade out of its misery once and for all. When they reached the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, however, the crew of the Virginia noticed that an unwelcome guest had joined the party, the USS Monitor. She was the North's secret weapon, a 172-foot-long Union gunboat that boasted 4-inch thick iron plating and featured 2 11-inch cannons mounted on a heavily armored revolving iron turret. The stage was set for the first ever battle between metal warships. The Monitor, her crew angry about the carnage wrought by the Virginia and eager to take advantage of the element of surprise, steamed toward her enemy like a bat out of Hades. The Virginia loaded her cannons, turned them towards the oncoming ship, and waited for the Monitor to get in range for a volley. The first barrage was fired around 9 a.m. as the Virginia unleashed a broadside at the oncoming Monitor. The Monitor, unfazed by the dozens of deadly cannonballs hurling towards her at incredibly high speeds, bravely steamed ahead in a single-minded mission to prove to this rebel warship that the Virginia wasn't the scariest thing on the high seas. The Monitor closed to fighting distance, loaded her weapons, as Confederate shells bounced off her heavy plate armor and unleashed a pair of gigantic shots from the twin cannons mounted in her turret. What followed was basically the naval version of two knights in shining armor wailing on each other with swords and axes as hard as they possibly could, smashing each other in a frantic attempt to penetrate the other's defenses and deal a crippling wound. From less than 100 yards away, shorter than the length of a single football field, these iron behemoths blasted each other with everything they had. Their obscenely big cannons pounding huge dents in the opposing vessel's armor and ripping off her smokestacks. The Virginia tried to ram the Monitor with her hastily rebuilt battering ram, but the hateful iron lance clanged harmlessly off the sloped iron of the Union ship. The Monitor returned fire, but another glancing blow bounced harmlessly off the Virginia's hull armor. After nearly 4 hours of non-stop battle, the crew of the Virginia changed up their tactics. Instead of trying to destroy the turret and guns of the Monitor, they started to aim at the less armored pilot house, the spot where the ship's captain and pilot were stationed. An explosive shell scored a direct hit, sending shrapnel into the face of Monitor Captain John L. Worden, temporarily blinding him with a white-hot chunk of superheated metal. With her captain injured and her ammunition low, the Monitor pulled back. The Virginia, taking on water in several places, was happy for the break and withdrew back to Norfolk. In the end, even though the CSS Virginia slapped around quite a few ships and temporarily put out the Monitor's captain's eyes, it wasn't enough to break the Union blockade of the Chesapeake Bay. The Virginia returned to port and never engaged the Union blockade fleet again. The Union forces landed at Yorktown, captured it, then marched across land and captured Norfolk on May 9th, without ever actually having to fight the Virginia again. Rather than let the Union have their beloved ship, the crew of the Virginia pulled all the cannons off her and sank the ship before they left town. Then headed north to join the defense of Richmond. Their outrageous attack would be the closest the Confederacy would come to breaking the Union naval blockade. Even though the battle was pretty indecisive, it was called a strategic Union victory, the message was heard loud and clear by all the navies of the world. Wood boats weren't just going to cut it anymore. After hearing the tales of the Virginia wrecking Union wooden ships like they were nothing, the navies of France, England, and half a dozen other European countries, not to mention the U.S. and Confederate navies, started replacing their out-of-date wood boats with top-of-the-line iron-armored vessels. And that, folks, is why you don't see wooden navy boats anymore. The Ironclad Plan. The Anaconda Plan. The Union naval blockade was part of the U.S. strategy known as the Anaconda Plan. Completely unrelated to the Ice Cube Jennifer Lopez movie, the Anaconda Plan was designed by General Winfield Scott as a method for squeezing the Confederates into submission like a constrictor snake by cutting off their contact with the outside world. It called for two things: a naval blockade of the Atlantic and the Gulf to prevent the rebels from importing weapons and supplies from Europe, and the capture of the Mississippi River and its major tributaries to split the Confederacy in half. Once these two things were in place, the Union would then be able to clamp down and force the South to depend on its own internal resources. With no factories, industry, or weapon-making capabilities to speak of, the Confederacy would be unable to continue to fight the war. You can see in the photograph here, Scott's Great Snake. That was the squeezing off, the idea of trapping those states in by themselves so that they couldn't get other supplies. The first ironclad. The first use of ironclad warships in battle was in 1592, when ultra-tough Korean Admiral Yi Sun-sin developed something called turtle ships. which sound kind of lame but were actually totally awesome. Fast-moving warships with reinforced metal plating completely covering the top deck to protect the sailors from enemy arrows and gunfire. These metal plates had big steel spikes sticking out of them to discourage boarding parties, and each turtle ship carried about 30 guns. As an excellent addition, the front of it was shaped like a cool-looking dragon that shot a flamethrower out of its mouth, had a smoke screen that came out of its nose, and could be used as a battering ram to crunch enemy ships into driftwood. Yi used these early model ironclads to barrel straight through the enemy lines, pinball around their formation, brick bearer style, ram the enemy flagships, and then set the enemy commander on fire with a dragon-headed blowtorch before he could coordinate a counterattack or figure out how he was supposed to stop this gigantic steel-plated nautical bowling ball. The Mason-Dixon Line. The Mason-Dixon Line, named after the two guys who drew it, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, the Mason-Dixon Line was the result of an epic border dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania that got so intense it required a special tag team of master surveyors to be brought in from England to deal with it. The 325-mile line, drawn between 1763 and 1767, is nowadays mostly remembered as serving as the official dividing line between free and slave states. You can see in the picture here the Battle of Hampton Roads. The Union had 1,400 sailors, and the Confederates had 188. Casualties: 369 Union soldiers perished, while only 24 Confederates did. But the result was still a Union victory. On this page, you see the comparison between the ships. So the CSS Virginia had 4,100 tons. Okay, now displacement means how much water that it separates from the surface. Its length was 263 feet. It could go a speed of 4 knots. 4 knots, I believe, is around 8 miles an hour, 7 miles an hour. I could be wrong. It had 320 officers and crew. Armament means the weapons that it had. It had 2 7-inch rifled cannons, 2 6 4/10-inch rifled cannons, 6 9-inch smoothbore cannons, and 2 12-inch howitzers. And howitzers in today's world would be, I think, considered like machine guns. Large bore weapon, but can repeatedly shoot. Now, the USS Monitor, it had 1,003 tons of displacement, much smaller. It was only 172 feet long. It was able to travel 6 knots, probably because it was a smaller in size. It only had 47 crew members and 10 officers on board, and it had 2 11-inch smoothbore cannons. That's all it had. And the USS Monitor is the ship that ended up taking out the CSS Virginia in the end. So apparently sleek and fast was much more effective. That's the end of Chapter 2. I hope you're having a great day.